Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher does paint for us how Mogadishu looked on the 7th of April 1843. Now, Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher was this British officer who had this big ship and he was traveling along the Somali coast in 1843. And he writes this article where he describes his journey beginning from Zanzibar all the way to Berbera. This article is part of a collection that I put together into a book, The Somalis and Their Lands. You can check the pinned comment to see where you can get the copy. And if you are watching on TikTok, you can look at my bio. Now, in this part, he tells us about the day that he arrived at Mogadishu, and he had been warned about going to Mogadishu, but he went anyways. Now, I need to warn you, though, that the description, of course, it was the British or the Europeans of the 19th century. They always viewed the world in what I call the racial hierarchy framework, or using the racial hierarchy framework. And that is the belief that some people are higher than others. And that informed how they interpreted the things they saw. For example, if they saw a well-built city, they automatically assumed there is no way that an African built that. It must have been built by somebody else. That's very common in these old documents. And if you interacted with them, of course, you've seen that. So we need to bear in mind when you're reading this that there is that is going to come up. And also, this description also, we can juxtapose it with the visit that was done by Ibn Battuta in the 13th century. More or less the same format of description, but Ibn Battuta was sort of different kind of description, because Ibn Battuta, he did not look at the people of Mogadishu through the lens of their inferior people and I'm a superior person. In fact, he had a lot of respect for the people. So his description is different. This is a British officer. His description is going to be different, but in some ways they are more or less in a similar format. But also we need to remember that Ibn Battuta was in Mogadishu in the 13th century, and Mogadishu at that time was at its height, especially going by how he describes it. This is in the 19th century. Mogadishu is sort of in decline as a city. Of course, later on it took a different path. Of course, that's what happens in history, is a wave. Anyways, let's read and see what he says about his visit on the 7th of April, 1843. We need to be, that's a specific day, of course. And this is what he writes. On the 7th April, anchoring at Mogadishu in the forenoon of the 7th, one of the guides was landed to inform the sheikh that I will wait on him. He said he will meet me. Now, the sheikh is the ruler of Mogadishu, of course. Interestingly, he calls him the sheikh, and Ibn Battuta also called him the sheikh. So he arrives and he sends a message that I'm here, I want to see you. Having heard at Brava and America of Mogadishu as the most treacherous place and dangerous even for a person to land at, I thought this play might have a good effect and ordered the Marines to accompany me on shore. So he had been warned actually that Mogadishu is not a place you just go into like that. In fact, some of the guides he had refused to go to Mogadishu. They told him, we cannot go to Mogadishu, especially the people will accuse them of bringing a Ferengi. I think that's the word he writes. That in fact, even in America, these guys were accused of bringing a Ferengi to them at the city, and that was not acceptable. So they told him Mogadishu is this place that you don't just go there like that, especially as a European. But he decided to go, and he decided he was going to meet the leader of Mogadishu. He calls him the Sheikh. The boats were accordingly manned and armed, and when at the back of the surf, a salute from the launch gun was fired in honor of the Sheikh. The beach was crowded with armed men. So he decided to do some honor for the sheikh. Of course, he's trying to make him to accept him, and he does this honor that his men are around, the men of the sheikh, they are armed. I had procured letters of introduction from the sheikhs of the Merka tribes, in addition to the ones from the Imam of Zanzibar, and I was not disappointed in a most friendly and even warm reception. So he had come with a letter from the Sultan of Zanzibar, an introduction letter. Then he arrives at Brava, he gets a letter. At Marka, he gets another letter, introduce it. That's how the old world used to work anyway. You needed somebody to introduce you to another person, especially when it came to political leadership and diplomacy. So he has these letters, and I've said this in another video, that he says that the letter from the Sultan of Zanzibar seemed like did not carry a lot of weight as he expected. Sometimes it was ignored. And that tells you that while the Sultan of Zanzibar had a lot of influence along the coast, the Somali coast, he did not have much authority. So That becomes very clear when you read this article. But anyway, the people of Mogadishu welcome him in a way that he did not expect. Seems like they were warm to him. They were happy to see him, sort of. They were very friendly. So whatever he was warned about, at least at this point, that had not happened. Then he says, the chief presented me with a bullock, and an Arab merchant, a sheriff, offered me a lodging and invited me to stop on shore. So the sheriff says, you are welcome, and then there's this Arab merchant who welcomes him and gives him a place to stay. Mogadishu, of course, Mogadishu is one of those cities, very interesting cities when it comes to the name. And I did do a video a while back saying that there are close to 17 or 18 ways that the name of Mogadishu is spelled. You read it one place is written a different way, you read another place is written a different way. I counted up to close to 18 ways the name is spelled. Of course, today, there is sort of a standardized spelling of the city, but that has not always been the case. Mogadishu, once the capital of a kingdom, is now half in ruins. It contains 3,000 or 4,000 inhabitants, Somalis, with perhaps 30 families of Arab origin. So it gives us the population of about 3,000, 4,000. I don't know how he counted that. I don't know how he arrived at those numbers. Maybe he asked around. We never know for sure. Here, the Somalis are residing in substantial stone houses that neither they nor their fathers ever built. Very interesting sentence he writes there, that the Somalis of Mogadishu lived in substantial stone houses. That means huge stone houses. But he says these are not houses they built, nor their fathers built. What is he insinuating here? Could be two things. Maybe one is saying that these are very old buildings that were there before their fathers were born. But it could also be he's insinuating that it's not the Somalis who built the houses. The houses were built by others. Probably one of those two. He continues, 4 watchtowers or perhaps belfries with interior spiral steps of superior constructions evinced the former reign of the Portuguese, but their remembrance has passed away from the present generation. There were these 4 watchtowers, and he says they built very well, built very nicely, and he says they were built by the Portuguese. Maybe they were built by the Portuguese, maybe not. Of course, remember I talked about the racial hierarchy framework that most of these old documents written by Europeans used to work with. They used to struggle with even giving benefit of doubt that it's an African who built something. Even where it was clearly the African, they will decide, no, it must have been built by somebody else. So he says, these watchtowers were built by the Portuguese, but that was not remembered by the people. The people themselves did not make that claim. That's important. The people present at that moment on the 7th of April 1843 did not remember that those watchtowers were built by the Portuguese, but Lieutenant Wilmot Christopher makes that claim. Maybe the Portuguese built it, I don't know. One building, which was evidently a church or chapel, with its aisles and chancel, contains a black marble slab bearing an inscription recording the piety of a sheriff who repaired it and dedicated it to Quranic devotion, the worshippers modestly saying the deed was undertaken in hopes of meriting heaven by its performance. So there's this building that he says it seems used to be a church. And if it used to be a church, then probably it was built by the Portuguese. Of course, that's how we are understanding these things. And this is that church had been converted into some sort of, maybe you could call it a religious learning center, sort of something of that kind. Then he says, the town has a ruinous, neglected appearance from the offing, and on entering it, the filth and poverty which present themselves are both distressing and offensive. Now, he talks of poverty in the city. So it looks like he went into the city and there were places where there was a lot of poverty and filth. Any city has that. Most cities, at least. Of course, there are countries that have very clean city through and through. But those are very few even today. Those are very few. Every city has a good side and a terrible side. And it seems like Mogadishu was that city. Hearing that the river before mentioned rolled by in the neighborhood, he's talking about the Shebele, I determined to remain on the shore and prosecute my inquiries. The house of the Bali sheriff, who will match in port and appearance with any fat priest in the world, is 3 stories high, flat-roofed, with dark narrow stairs, but capacious rooms, and might, if kept clean and furnished, be a very tolerable dwelling. So the house he was to stay at seems like it was a huge house, well designed. The windows small, some had Venetian blinds, all wooden shutters, the only furniture being height stretched on wooden bed frames and strong chest. So that's Mogadishu of that time. That's 1843. Very interesting, I think. I found this part to be very interesting and I decided to do a video about it. Now you can get this book, as I said, from Amazon. Check my description box, pinned comment, or you can also check the bio if you are watching on TikTok. Those are my random thoughts.